Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode in my ongoing series of interviews with UDRP service providers. My name is Doug Isenberg. I am a domain name attorney and founder of the GigaLaw firm, and I also serve as a domain name panelist at a number of providers, including at the Asian Domain Name Dispute Resolution Center, whose guests are with me today. So the Asian Domain Name Dispute Resolution Center, or ADNDRC, is one of 6 ICANN approved providers for the UDRP, the Uniform Domain Name Dispute Resolution Policy. And the ADNDRC was jointly established by the China International Economic and Trade Arbitration Commission and the Hong Kong International Arbitration Center in 2002. The HKIAC is actually one of 4 offices for the ADNDRC, the others being in Seoul, Beijing, and Kuala Lumpur. The Hong Kong office, represented by the HKIAC, was actually established back in 1985, even before, of course, cyber squatting even existed, to assist parties in solving disputes by arbitration and other means of alternative dispute resolution. And although the ADNDRC and HKIAC perhaps are not as well known here in the United States or maybe even in other parts of the world outside of Asia as compared with some of the other UDRP service providers, it has seen a spike in domain name disputes recently. So today, I will be talking with my guests to introduce you to their organization and also discuss some important domain name dispute issues, including some of the current trends. And with that, let me introduce both of my guests. First, I am honored to have with me today Kiran Sanghera, who serves as Secretary General of the Asian Domain Name Dispute Resolution Center, as well as Special Counsel for the Hong Kong International Arbitration Center. Kiran leads HKIAC's Domain Name Dispute Resolution team, and she oversees its business development initiatives. I'm also very honored to have with us today Tom Leung, an ADR case manager for HKIAC. And together, I think Kiran and Tom can provide us with a broad overview of the ADNDRC and HKIAC, as well as some detailed insights about their operations and domain name disputes in general. So with that, Kiran, let me start with you and ask if you perhaps could begin by providing a bit more detail than I did in my brief remarks about your background as well as an introduction to the ADN-DRC and HKIAC. Kiran?
Thank you, Doug, and thank you also for the kind invitation to Tom and myself to participate in this interview series. As you mentioned, it's a really good opportunity for us to share more details about HKIAC and ADNDRC with users in your region and globally. So thank you for involving us in this fantastic initiative. About myself, very briefly, as you said, I'm Special Counsel at the HKIAC, and I have another hat, Secretary General of the ADNDRC. I've been involved with institutions for about 12 years now, both arbitration, mediation, and domain name dispute resolution. So really a clear focus on what institutions need to be doing to serve users of alternative dispute resolution better. Coming to HKIAC, you had a very succinct introduction, and I'll provide a little bit more detail, and I'll start with HKIAC, given it was established earlier, as you said, in 1985. So HKIAC started out as an arbitration center, the Hong Kong International Arbitration Center, and we've been running for over 35 years now. Added on to those the arbitration services, mediation, adjudication, and of course today's topic, domain name dispute resolution. Given the experience we have, the number of years we've been doing dispute resolution work, we're of course long established in the region and also internationally recognized. So quite recently, this year in fact, we were ranked 3rd institution globally for dispute resolution by a survey conducted by the University of London, Queen Mary, and the international law firm White & Case, and HKIAC was ranked 3rd preferred institution for dispute resolution globally. So we have a distinct Asia focus, as one might expect, but also international recognition. We did, as you mentioned, Doug, establish the ADNDRC and become an accredited UDRP provider in 2002. So we've actually been involved with that work for quite some time as well. And I'll move on to ADNDRC. So we established the ADNDRC largely in part to respond to a gap in the market at the time, I suppose. There wasn't an Asian-based UDRP provider, and one of the council members of HKIAC who had significant foresight could see that this area was one that could lead to significant growth. And so after discussions with ICANN and going through the relevant procedures, we were established the ADNDRC, that is, in 2002, together with CTAC. So the founding offices, in fact, of ADNDRC were the Hong Kong office, HKIAC, and the Beijing office, represented by CTAC. Now, over the years, the ADNDRC organization has, in fact, grown. There are 2 more offices that were added, and that's the Kuala Lumpur office, represented by the AIAC, and they joined in 2006. And most recently in 2009, the Seoul office, represented by the KIDRC. So today, where the ADNDRC is an organization represented by 4 distinct offices that work together, and we offer UDRP services. Now, just to finish on HKIAC and domain name dispute resolution, in addition to our role as the Hong Kong office of ADNDRC, HKIAC in its own right can administer and handle domain name disputes arising out of .hk, .cn, and .ph domain names. So we're authorized under the relevant policies there.
And I'm curious, so do you know off the top of your head what proportion of the domain name disputes fall within the UDRP versus the specific country code or CCTLD dispute policies that you were referring to?
Yeah, very important question, Doug. So by far, the majority of domain name disputes that we handle is in our role as the Hong Kong office of ADNDRC, so they're UDRP. And then the smaller percentage is .cn, and smaller still is .hk. So I would say, we're looking at 80%, 70 to 80% UDRP. Absolutely,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, and certainly that's my focus is on the UDRP, which applies to .com, .net, .org, and all of the new GTLDs, as well as I think about 40 of the CCTLDs, but obviously there are other CCTLD specific policies. Let me ask both of you a little bit, if you could explain a little bit about how the ADNDRC differs, if it does in any way, from the other UDRP service providers. Obviously, as you said, your organization has been a part of the UDRP process almost since the beginning. I believe the first UDRP decision was decided in the year 2000. And today, we, as I said in my introductory remarks, there are 6 providers. How is your organization different or the same as any of the others?
Yeah, Doug, maybe I can kick off and Tom can supplement. I think this won't be a surprise given where we are, where our offices are, and in the name. We have obviously a strong focus on Asia. And I think that is quite unique when you think about the staff that will be handling your domain name dispute, and importantly, the panelists that may be appointed for your domain name dispute. So for us, this geographical focus and jurisdiction expertise is something that stands out. We are still the only UDRP provider in the Asia Pacific region. Obviously, things like language become very important. So across the offices, we can handle English, of course, Mandarin, Cantonese, Korean, Malay, Japanese, most of the languages that you will find in the Asia Pacific region, as well as European languages, French, Spanish, and Turkish and Russian. But there's really a deep focus on Asia. Importantly there, what that means for the work that we do is when we're appointing panelists as ADNDRC, we appoint from the ADNDRC panel. So across all 4 of the offices, we appoint from the same panel. As you would anticipate, the ADNDRC panel is also populated by a strong group of panelists who have experience in this region as well as internationally, and importantly have the necessary language requirements for the cases that we handle. We have, I would say, certainly for the Hong Kong office and even more so for the Beijing office of ADNDRC, significant proportion of cases that have a Chinese language element. It may not mean that the language of the proceedings is in fact Chinese, although I'd say about 50-50 in terms of the percentages English and Chinese that we handle, but that there may be some documentation in Chinese. And for us to have a Chinese language element, I think that's about 90% of the cases that we handle. So having panelists that have at least some exposure to Chinese language or for the Asian region is quite important. But keeping in mind that we want to appoint panelists that are neutral and independent and don't have necessarily a geographical attachment to one of the locations of the parties. There you'll find within our panel a really strong group of experienced, linguistically capable and neutral location or nationality panelists. So I think that's quite unique. Of course, our staff can handle cases in those languages. And I think where we fit quite neatly is having the Asia focus, but operating internationally at an international standard. So I think that's probably an obvious point to make, but something that really is quite different,
and let me
perhaps
just
compared to some of the others.
Jump in for just a moment to explain to those who may be watching who aren't as intimately familiar with how language plays into the UDRP process. So by default, the language of a UDRP proceeding is intended to be the language of the registrar's registration agreement for the domain name that is the subject of the dispute, subject to essentially the discretion of the panel to decide otherwise depending upon the facts and circumstances of the case. So I imagine then that your UDRP proceedings, you're saying, typically involve registrars as well that are in the Asian area. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. That's
okay.
right.
Okay. So I'm kind of curious then how often language becomes an issue. And by that, I mean, I see this regularly in cases that I either decide as a panelist or file as complainant's counsel, where it seems apparent that as an English speaker, I'll wear that hat, it seems apparent that the registrant of the domain name either speaks English or is targeting English speakers, yet has used a registrar with a registration agreement that may be, as you said, in Chinese. And then this issue arises as to what actually is the appropriate language for the proceeding. And so, Kiran, I don't know if that's an issue that you can speak to, or Tom, I know you're involved a bit in the day-to-day of the nuts and bolts of administering some of the cases. And maybe you can talk about both the language issue and other issues that arise sort of after a complaint is filed.
Yeah, I think I can kick off, Tom. In terms of how we handle those situations, I mean, what we commonly see is perhaps the language of the registration agreement is Chinese, but the complainant files its complaint in English. What we will do as an institution, because we're able to do that easily, is to provide bilingual correspondence of everything that we're handling up until the point that the panelist is appointed, and therefore at that point the panelist will make the determination when it comes to language. So what we do, and it's not infrequent, that's how we approach as an institution the question around the language that we should be using before finally the language has been determined by the panel. So from a procedural perspective, that's been our certainly been our approach. Tom, I don't know if you want to chip in.
Oh yeah, sure. So first of all, thank you so much, Doug, for your invitation. Perhaps I can also share a little bit about the supplemental rules, because for UDRP providers, they will have to follow the same UDRP rules and also policy. But actually for supplemental rules, all the providers have their own version. So we do have some slight variations in terms of our supplemental rules with other UDRP providers. So for example, first of all, for our fees, HKIAC and ADNDRC have a clear and fixed fee schedule for all policies, for example, UDRP, CNDRP, and HKDRP, based on the numbers of the disputed domain names and also the constitution of the panel, which could be a single member or three-member panel. One thing to note is that we have no additional charges for the supplemental filings, ratification of complaints, or the extension of filing a response. So this might be something that we are different from other providers. Also, in terms of requirements of the complaint, for example, we know WIPO requires that in the factual and legal grounds section, the word limit shall be 5,000 words. And also, forum requires the complaints or responses could not exceed 15 pages. But for HKIAC and ADNDRC, we only have a word limit of 3,000 maximum for the factual and legal grounds section, while there's no other word limits for other section or the or page limits. So more on the ratification of the registry information in complaints, it's quite common that registry information is hidden nowadays because of the inaccessible information in public databases, especially after the passing of the GDPR, making it quite difficult for complainants to know who is only the domain name. So what HKIAC offers is that after the complainant submits the complaint, we validate the registry information with the concerned registrar and provide the disclosed whose information to the complainant to ratify the complaints. So moreover, some complainants, especially those smaller in size, could be quite hard to reach. In order to validate the registration information and ensure the domain name is logged during the proceeding, which is necessary for the case to proceed, we work very closely with ICANN to liaise with unresponsive registrars to ensure cases could be moved forward pursuant to the stipulated timeline.
Great, thanks, Tom. So let me actually just follow up on a couple of things that you said. One is the word limit of 3,000 words. That applies to both the complaint and the response. Is that correct?
Right.
And I'm just curious because, you know, I write a lot of complaints and I've written responses as well. And I will say even with the 5,000 word limit that I've seen at one of the other providers that you mentioned, that's a pretty large limit. The only time that I've encountered issues is if there's a larger complaint, multiple domain names, maybe multiple trademarks involved, maybe even, you know, multiple complainants or respondents if that's appropriate for the case. Is the 3,000 word limit ever an issue? Do you, during that sort of administrative compliance process, ever have to notify a party that they have exceeded a word limit?
We actually have different model complaints or model responses, which is quite different from other providers. So in our complaints or response forms, we do have different sections for different, for example, contention or factual information or some relevant evidence about the trademark. So for example, for contention, we do have a word limit. But for other factual information, we do not have any page limit or word limits. So basically, we provide sufficient room or for complainants or respondents to represent themselves in domain name cases, and it has never been an issue in terms of the word limit.
No, never been an issue. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
That does not surprise me. On the fees, let me and just to back up a bit, maybe to expand kind of the general issue, and you touched on this. All of the UDRP providers administer the exact same UDRP policy. All of the UDRP providers also use the same set of UDRP rules. But what you're speaking about and what we're talking about are the supplemental rules, which do vary slightly from provider to provider. And one of those points that you mentioned is on fees, and the fee schedules are published, so they're easy to see on your website, and I'll include certainly information in the links in the description along with this video where anybody can take a look at those. But what about the issue that sometimes arises when a UDRP dispute is settled before a decision is actually reached? I know there seems to be a little bit of a difference among the providers as to refunds of a portion of the filing fees. How does your organization handle refunds in the event of a settlement?
Yeah, I think I can touch on a little bit about our refund policy. ADNDRC do have clear refund policy for administrative fees and also penalty fees. For admin fees, we align with the discretion provided in the UDRP rules, and so we arrange refunds based on the stages of the proceeding. For instance, we refund 2/3 of the admin fee prior to the administrative compliance review of the complaints, 1/3 of the admin fee after the commencement of proceeding, and prior to the pen appointment. And also prior to the pen appointment, we refund the penalty fee in full in the event of withdrawal. So there will be no refund of the admin fee or the penalty fee after the pen appointment. Having a clear refund policy is particularly helpful in dealing with events of, for example, consolidation of cases, rejection, or withdrawal of cases.
Great, thanks. And I'm curious, anecdotally, and I know that sometimes, my experience is not necessarily the general rule, but I've encountered a lot more disputes recently in which the parties are settling prior to appointment of the panel. Is that something that you're seeing? Is that any different in the past year or two? Are more cases being settled, or do you not know?
We don't see an obvious trend of having more settled cases. But actually, what stipulated the rules and supplemental rules, we can cater parties to reach settlement efficiently and also according to the rules and also our supplemental rules.
Okay, great, thanks. So what about the actual filing process itself? One of the attractions, obviously, of the UDRP is that it is a streamlined process with filings taking place online, and obviously it's relatively inexpensive and relatively quick. But what can you speak just a little bit about the mechanics of the filing process and the resources? I'll ask both of you, the resources that you offer to parties who are considering filing a complaint at one of the offices, whether it's the HKIAC or one of the other offices of the ADN DRC. How would somebody go about learning logistically how to file a complaint?
Yeah, Tom, do you want to perhaps talk about the filing process and how we handle that?
Oh yeah, sure. So basically, all domain name cases shall be filed electronically via emails. We do have, from time to time, we receive questions from, for example, complainants, practitioners, and also respondents about some procedural issues or questions about how they can file and also what to be included in a complaint. HKIAC offers dedicated support at all stages of proceedings or even prior to the submission. Also one thing to mention is that we also publish the guide to HKIAC domain name dispute resolution to provide a general overview of HKIAC domain name practice, in-depth analysis of procedural and also substantive issues, for example, refiling complaints, consolidation, passive holdings. So all these kind of resources will be quite useful to sort of answer the questions of people who are interested to submit domain name cases or to protect their IP rights in terms of domain names. And also one thing to note is that as Kiran mentioned, as Kiran has mentioned, we have quite a lot of Chinese elements involved in our cases. So that's why in our guide, we also cover some Chinese elements, for example, Chinese characters or pinyin or transliteration in other words, which could be quite valuable to both complainants and respondents, given most of our cases involve Chinese elements and or materials. And also one thing to share is that HKIAC will be launching case digest platform for domain name decisions next year. So this is a platform where all the domain name decision could be searched with legal indexes. So we think this is particularly useful when complainants, respondents, or anyone in the domain name community to find past cases with certain circumstances, findings, or contentions. So apart from the policy rules or the documents published on our websites, which could enable complainants and respondents to get familiar with the domain name dispute proceedings, we also offer all sorts of extra resources. For example, the guide, some webinars which are also available on our website, and also the case digest platform that we are going to launch next year. So that we try to make all the information more accessible to parties and everyone, and so that it should be an obstacle for them to represent themselves or to submit cases to us.
That's great to know, because all of the UDRP providers are required to publish decisions, but how accessible those decisions are, certainly varies from provider to provider. So it sounds like you're saying in 2022 we will see some enhanced search capabilities and other access to the decisions. Is that right? And so I applaud that and look forward to that. That's great to know. Let's talk a bit about some of the trends that you may be seeing, especially, we're now heading, as we're recording this, we're almost, 2 years into the coronavirus pandemic, and, in a way, domain name disputes are, perfectly situated for administering, even while people are working at home and all of the other constraints of the pandemic. But maybe if you could speak a little bit about how the pandemic has affected your operations, if at all, and what sort of trends that you have seen recently, both related to the pandemic and perhaps even unrelated to the pandemic.
Yeah, I can take that, Doug, at least initially. I think important question about the pandemic and how that's affected our operations. Having our HQ in Hong Kong has had its benefits throughout the pandemic, because we've never had to close the offices. So in terms of having access to what you might need, although domain name dispute resolution is actually very suitable for working outside of the office, given it's such a paperless process. But we have always had access to materials. So fortunately, we've operated, I would say, as normally as one might expect us to operate in usual times. And that's just by the fact of the Hong Kong having relatively few cases and no major lockdowns. In terms of our operations and how we've worked, and then how that's translated into some of the data that we've seen, case numbers, interestingly, have generally been on an upward rise. Last year there was a dip, which was quite interesting, because I think
and just to clarify, when you say last year, you're referring to the year 2020, is that correct?
That's correct.
Because
yeah,
we're actually just recording this in December 2021, but viewers may not see it until January 2022. So just to clarify, you're referring to a dip in the year 2020, is that right?
That's right, yes, and thank you for that clarification. It's true, as we record things and release them at later dates, it's definitely something we need to keep in mind rather than when we speak live. So yes, in 2020, we had a slight dip in the caseload, and I think that was partially to do with some of the quite long-lasting and severe lockdowns in other parts of the world, particularly mainland China. where access to some materials that one might need, or maybe possibly legal advice, was difficult, and the pandemic was still new, so perhaps people hadn't adjusted to that. And given that a lot of our filings do come from mainland Chinese parties, that might have explained the dip, because if we were to look at 2020 from a month-to-month perspective, there was certainly a dip at the first part of the year, but then that did pick up. So I think that was to do with people in mainland China, but elsewhere, adjusting to what working meant throughout the pandemic. This year, interestingly, case filings have been high, and we are going back to some of the figures we had pre-pandemic, and even some of the highest figures we've had over the last 10 years. But the year is not out, and as I mentioned, the UDRP filings are by far the highest number of filings. Just on that, as I mentioned, I think what we've seen over the last few years is more mainland Chinese parties filing complaints than previously. You might be interested to know, especially given your location, Doug, and those of some of your viewers, the US actually features in our top 5 geographical location by complainant fairly frequently. In the past 4 years or so, a US entity has been a complainant a significant number of times. So they always feature in the top 5 if you're classing your complainants by geographical location. So we are seeing US entities come through. Others include obviously Hong Kong, Singapore, and then European, those based in Europe, Germany, Switzerland, France. So it's quite a broad geographical base from where the complainants come. Respondents, on the other hand, it's interesting. I think we've seen quite a high number of respondents from mainland China, and that's been fairly consistent over the last few years. Again, we do have obviously other respondents coming from different places, again, including the US, parts of Europe and other parts of Asia, but it's a significant drop in the number. So by far, mainland Chinese parties are most frequently respondents. But that should give your users a flavour, or your viewers a flavour of the fact that, yes, deep Asia focus, mainland Chinese expertise, but actually, our international approach is also seen in the types of parties that we deal with globally. Probably not so much of a trend or a change, but I imagine it's much the same for many of the dispute resolution providers, but the success rate is pretty consistent, 97% plus year in, year out. The domain names are transferred or possibly cancelled, but by far majority transferred. And touched on language a little bit. For us, certainly the Hong Kong office and for the Beijing office, it's definitely the case. Our English and Chinese language proceedings, the official language of the proceedings, it's really a 50-50 split between English and Chinese. And that's been pretty much the same over the last 4 or 5 years. So Chinese is becoming more and more prevalent for sure. So I think that should give a bit of a flavour of the demographic of our users. And then when it comes to panelists, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, we actually appoint fairly diversely if we're looking at geographical origin. In cases, for example, where we have a mainland Chinese complainant and let's say a US respondent, we do endeavour to appoint a person who's not from either of those locations if we can. That may include a Hong Kong person because separate legal jurisdictions, but I think the fact that we make these efforts to appoint a neutral geographical location reflects in the diversity of our appointments. So, Australian, US appointees, Singaporean, Hong Kong, mainland Chinese. It's much more diverse in terms of how we approach appointments and where those appointees are coming from. I think it's helpful for our work also to appoint as diversely as possible to kind of enrich the decisions that we're seeing coming out of the centre. And another area just on this that's been an area we've focused on is also diversity in terms of gender of the appointments that we're making. So we've gone up usually in the last few years from about 35 or 25% to 50% at times in terms of the male to female ratio of appointees. But a long way to go there, because you also need to have a panel that's fairly diverse and gender balanced in order to be able to appoint in the same sort of way. So we're hoping to get there. But those are just to give a bit of a snapshot of some trends that we see, but also what our work looks like in terms of demographic of complainant, respondent, and panelist.
That's fantastic. Let me ask, because I know we're about out of time, but maybe two questions related to what you've both been talking about as far as trends and other issues. First, I just want to elaborate on something that Tom was talking about a few minutes ago. For those who may not be familiar with the GDPR acronym, the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, and its impact on UDRP proceedings. Tom, I think what you were saying, and certainly what I have seen in my experience, is as a result of the GDPR's arrival in recent years, a lot of data on domain name registrants is no longer publicly available in the WHOIS records. But that is not preventing trademark owners from filing complaints under the UDRP, and that in some or many or all cases, maybe you can elaborate, the registrars are providing that information after a complaint has been filed. I know that can be frustrating to the complainant in the first place, but is it my understanding from what you had said that there is an opportunity to amend the complaint once that information becomes available? And I guess also just sort of generally, how often, maybe you don't have a number, but how often is this an issue, either that the registrant data is not available because of the GDPR, or perhaps because of the sort of increased use, as I see it, of privacy and proxy services?
Yeah, sure. Actually, it's quite common for us to see that the complaints initially submitted by the complainants are actually, they don't have the registration information ready by that time. So usually the way they do is actually they submit the complaints to us, and then we validate the registration information with the concerned registrar. And then because if they contact the registrar directly, it's less likely that they will get the quiz information disclosed. So after they submit the UDRP case to the center, we contact the registrar to ask them to disclose the quiz information, as well as to place the lock to the disputed domain name to ensure there's no transfer of the ownership during the proceeding. So after we validate and also we get the quiz information disclosed, we provide to the complainant to ratify the complaint. This is actually particularly helpful to complainant to identify who is owning the disputed domain name, as because for some complaints, actually they can involve more than one domain names. So by the validation process, they can identify maybe a number of disputed domain names that they can potentially consolidate to make it to file within one single complaint. This is, I think this is one helpful thing we can provide to complainants in terms of identifying the identity of the respondent.
Great, thanks. And the second, or perhaps last question that I just wanted to throw out there is, can either of you talk about any trends as far as the type of cyber squatting activity that respondents may be engaging in? Again, anecdotally, it seems like I've seen a lot of more domain name registrants engaging in phishing activity of some kind. You know, in the early days of cyber squatting, of course, you know, there was a lot of pornography. I'm just curious if the type of activity that you're seeing is in recent years has changed in any way as far as how respondents are using their domain names.
I think in terms of the bad faith acts or any kind of actions in relation to domain name system abuse, I think they can be quite diverse. And In general, we don't see an obvious trend of like which kind of ads are more are getting more popular, or which kind of ads are less likely to happen more frequently. So we do see quite maybe I can share a few common bad faith activities that we see mostly in our UDRP cases. So first of all should be for commercial gain. For example, cyber squatter or registrants in bad faith, they registered the domain names that are identical or confusingly similar to complainants marked to set up, for example, e-commerce website or pay-per-click websites for commercial gain. This is one of the quite common bad faith acts that we can see in our cases. The second, like what you mentioned, there could be associated with some phishing or some cyber threats activities. We don't see obvious growing trend for this kind of abuses, but we do see these kind of activities from time to time in our cases. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Tom. So now I'll throw it out there. If either of you want to share any other thoughts about domain name disputes in general, the UDRP in particular, or anything that either of you would like anybody to know about the ADNDRC and your HKIAC office, please, I'll let you have the closing comments.
I think ADNDRC or HKIAC is quite special because like what Kiran has shared is we are the only provider of UDRP in the Asia Pacific region. Because we provide because in domain name dispute, although the whole proceeding is conducted electronically, but there's actually a lot of communication between the center, the complainants, the respondent, or any representative of the parties. So that's why the reason why we can carry out domain name complaints efficiently is because of the dedicated support we can offer to the parties, and also especially the language capability of our team, and also of all officers of ADNDRC as well as our panel. So I think this is some key cornerstone for our efficient proceedings, and also why people are choosing to file complaints with HKIAC or ADNDRC.
Great, thanks, Tom. Kiran, any closing comments?
Yeah, I think I can just say that having the perspective of a sort of established dispute resolution center, that's the HKIAC, and bringing that to the domain name work, I think what we have added certainly over recent times, and what we're committed to, is the efficiency of the process. So, to ensure that yes, we stick to the deadlines that are applicable in the rules, but how do we do that internally? And we have lots of different measures and steps that we take to make sure panelists are rendering their decisions on time, that panelists are appointed in a fair and neutral way. And also when it comes to costs, our pricing is competitive, and I think that our refund policy also gives users a fair opportunity. So I think what you get with HKIAC and the Hong Kong office and the other offices of ADNDRC is really that Asia-focused international standard, and really a commitment to kind of the efficiency and effectiveness of domain name dispute resolution process, which in itself is really a fantastic and rapid solution that in 97% plus of the cases we handle is effective for complainants. And just to thank you, Doug, for the opportunity again.
Oh, well, the pleasure is mine. I appreciate both of you taking a lot of time to talk about what you do and about your service provider. So Kiran Sanghera, Tom Leung, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.